fellow travelers. Welcome to the 34th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Turford, the level 99 human Archmage, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, lovely evening, good sir?
I'm doing excellent. Guys, I'm sorry, I don't have a cup of coffee or espresso or whatever. It is 8 p.m. where I'm at right now, so I've long overdrank my caffeine levels for the day, but I'm doing well. How about you, Ryan?
I'm doing good. I mean, I think that we could probably retire the bit of the cup of coffee, Garret, because now our recording time is going to be like 8 p.m. your time all the time now. So no more cups of coffee, I'm afraid. And unless you're Ryan, but I don't drink caffeine anymore. So because I'm up until like 4 a.m. every night because I'm a crazy person. But enough about me. Let's of course clean the dungeons of these pesky mobs. So folks at home, if you want to support the show, there's a number of awesome ways you can do that. Number one, you can support us by subscribing to us on your podcast feed of choice, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're all the places you find podcasts. So check us out there. Of course, rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That definitely helps the show get discovered as well. Also, if you're watching on YouTube and you want to see our beautiful faces every single week, youtube.com/YouMakeCapri is how you do that. Of course, like, subscribe, share, binge, all those things that people on YouTube tell you to do. And then last but not least, if you want early access to this and all of our shows, head over to Patreon. Patreon.com/YouMakeCapri is how you do that. Throw a load of tip in the old tip jar and out comes content. And we have some exciting stuff that's coming up next week that we can't talk about yet, but I'm very excited for next week, Garret.
Yes.
That's all I'm going to say. So,
Ryan, I have a question.
What I did.
Do we have any reviews on podcast services, either Google, Apple?
Not for this show. Not for this show. I don't. In fact, I think we read. I think there was one a long time ago, and we read it on the show.
Yeah, there was one a long time ago.
But it's been a while since we've gotten an Apple Podcast review. So, but if you do, folks at home, if you do leave an Apple Podcast review, we'll read it on the show, even if you give us one star.
We'll read it out loud.
Yes, exactly. But
no matter how irrelevant or stupid it is, we will read it.
I mean, to be fair, we
say it out loud.
We read a lot of non-Xbox ones on the Xbox Drive before. Yeah, so it wouldn't be the first time that we had an Apple Podcast review that had nothing to do with the podcast. But enough about all that stuff. Let's read from the secret tasks. I feel like there's going to be a lot already before we mess around with this other stuff. So today's topic of conversation is Vanillaware, one of my favorite Japanese companies around in the world of games today. They're known for being kind of a smaller studio, more of they're not necessarily an indie studio, but they have kind of that indie studio feel to them, at least when you look at kind of, Japanese studio standards. But at the same time, they produce some amazingly high quality games. And that's why I wanted to talk about them, because I want people to kind of, learn more about Vanillaware, because Garret, we called out for questions for this week's show. We didn't receive any questions, but more than anything, we received questions from the audience saying, who is Vanillaware? So if anything,
heard of them.
The purpose of this show is to kind of, educate people about it. And whenever we get a response from the community, it gets me even more excited to do the show, Garret, because then it's like I love kind of discovering games that I've never heard of myself. So the joy of giving that to someone else just gets me super excited to do the show. So
there you go. Educating them.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm excited to get into this. So we're kind of going to talk about each one of Vanillaware's games, but also kind of talk about the company as a whole and kind of their history. So of course, as we always do, let's start with fun facts. And Garret, you can probably get a cup of coffee, sit back, relax, because I got a lot to say, but feel free to jump in whenever about this. Because we're going to start with their history first, and then we're going to talk about each of the games individually. Okay. So Vanillaware's history starts with company president George Kamatami. He's basically like a big reason of why Vanillaware does the projects it works on, or kind of his history plays a big part into how the company became, the company it is today in a lot of ways. He actually used to work at Capcom in the 80s and early 90s, both as an artist and a designer. He worked on a bunch of the D&D arcade games from Capcom, because Capcom did a bunch of like Dungeons and Dragons licensed arcade games. And he actually was either the lead on them or he was the artist on a lot of them. He's not really a programmer or anything like that, but he mostly works on like game design or just on the artist end anyways. But so he ended up actually leaving Capcom in 1994, basically to just become like a freelancer, because he wanted to try a whole bunch of different stuff. Whereas Capcom was having him kind of like almost like stuck on like one or two specific things, like whether like either like there any fantasy games that they put out or just a bunch of stuff that he just wasn't super interested in anymore. So along the lines, he actually got hired at Atlas to work on Princess Crown, which was a Sega Saturn game that came out in 1997. And Garrett, I know you're probably shaking your head over there because you're like, what the heck is this game? But the name probably sounds familiar. It's got Crown in it.
Very
it's
similar.
A 2-word name to another Vanillaware game. And basically, Princess Crown was a side-scrolling action-adventure RPG, very similar to Odin Sphere, which is one of Vanillaware's games where you play as multiple characters, each with their own campaigns, and you basically have this town, like hub town you explore, and then each story mission has you go to a different location that then has like multiple levels to it. So as you side scroll through the environment, you beat up enemies, and then you pick up treasure, and then you go to different parts of the areas until you eventually fight a boss. So again, very similar to a lot of other Vanillaware games. But again, a lot of people haven't heard of this game. Number one, because it's on the Sega Saturn. Number two, it came out in Japan only. So never saw a North American release, which is the fate of a lot of Sega Saturn games, unfortunately. And ultimately, it came out around the end of the Sega Saturn's life cycle in 1997, when like no one was buying the console or buying like any games for the console. So it was basically considered like a critical failure and a commercial failure. Like the game reviewed really well at the time through magazines, but no one bought the dang thing. So it's actually considered a cult classic today from a lot of Sega Saturn fans. So it's one of those games on Saturn that's one of the more expensive Japanese import games because
got it.
For Sega Saturn collectors out there or people who are interested in collecting for the platform, generally you collect the Japanese versions of games rather than the North American versions because they're way cheaper because they just made so many more of them. But this is like one of the more expensive Japanese only games for that reason. So after the release of Princess Crown, George decided to actually found his own small company in 2002 called Puraguru. Puraguru. It's an odd name. In Tokyo. Yeah. At the time, the company only had 3 employees: George, as well as an artist named Shigetaki, and Kentaro Onoshi, who was a programmer who was new to the industry. So they basically started the company with 3 people, and they're like, we're going to make games. It's going to be great. Which, again, sounds like a lot of indie companies today, but yeah, think about the time period 2002. There were a lot of companies like that were that small making games.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy to think about. So after that happened, their very first project that they were actually brought in for was an Enix game that actually started in 2001 called Fantasy Earth, which is an MMO that was released in Japan, eventually came out here in 2010. And it's actually still running today, believe it or not.
Wow.
So before George and the team actually joined up with Enix to develop this game, the game was going to be a vampire versus human MMO in like the present day, essentially. But George coming into to becoming the lead developer, he's like, no, I want to do a fantasy game. It's an MMO, and I like fantasy stuff. So, especially considering his background too, with Princess Crown and D&D. So they completely changed the entire style of this game to basically be a fantasy like action adventure MMO, kind of similar to something like Phantasy Star Online, or a couple of other like action RPG MMOs. But it was just, in a fantasy setting rather than sci-fi. However, due to multiple factors such as the Enix merger with Squaresoft that was happening around the time, Puraguru decided to leave the project in 2004, and development was handed over to a different team called Multiterm, which again, the game released in Japan on PC in 2006, and again, is still around today. So after all that happened, because there was the last game that they basically developed on a larger scale, Princess Crown, was kind of a commercial failure. A lot of companies didn't really want to work with the company themselves. So what they decided to do after they had left the project is in 2004, they decided to move the company to Osaka and rebrand the company as Vanillaware. So that's kind of where the name Vanillaware came from, because they wanted to kind of like, there was some bad blood associated with the old name and kind of with the reputation. So they wanted to kind of start fresh with the name Vanillaware. So they ramped up staffing and began work on Odin Sphere with Atlas because Atlas decided to give them another chance to see if they could, put out a new game. However, the game was delayed because it was supposed to come out in 2006 originally, but it was pushed back to 2007 in order not to cannibalize with the sales of other Atlas games that were releasing at the same time. Because in 2006, that's when Persona 3 came out, Girl Lancer, a bunch of games from Atlas were coming out that year. I think there was like 6 or 7 games from Atlas already in 2006. Wow. So they didn't want Odin Sphere to kind of cannibalize the sales of that. Additionally, though, the main reason why Atlas decided to do this is because they viewed this as Vanillaware's last chance to be in this industry. Like basically this was kind of, Odin Sphere was kind of like their make or break kind of game where if it failed, that was it for the company because George and the team basically had to take out a bunch of loans to keep the company afloat.
Oh man.
But then because the game was delayed a year, they weren't really able to make money to keep the company afloat. So they actually had to make another deal. So they ended up having to do a separate game with NIS at the time because they had actually come to Vanillaware with the idea of like pitching them the freedom to basically make whatever game they felt like playing. So at the time that this was happening, the company itself, Vanillaware, all their employees were really obsessed with this little game you might have heard of called StarCraft. I don't know if you've heard of this game before. Oh my God. Pretty popular. So they wanted to make a real-time strategy game, but NIS wanted to put out the game out on consoles, on PlayStation 2. So that's where they came up with the idea of Grimoire, which kind of, if you've ever seen Grimoire, kind of like fuses the visual style of something like Odin Sphere or Dragon's Crown, but with a real-time strategy game, which is like really interesting to see and cool.
This is unreal.
Yeah. So they were basically desperate for money at that point. So they're like, we got to make something. So the NIS luckily was there to kind of bail them out. And luckily, both games actually came out in 2007 because the interesting thing about Grimoire is that it only took them 6 months to start the game, build the game from start to finish, from pre-production to it's out the door kind of thing. But it wasn't like plagued with bugs or anything like that. It was just like a really focused experience that didn't require like a long dev cycle essentially. So both games actually sold pretty well as far as sales were concerned, especially Odin Sphere in particular. It was actually like one of the last like really big games on the PlayStation 2, along with Persona 4 was the other one that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about like late PS2 games. God of War 2 is the other one that I think of as well, that came out around those times. So both games came out in 2007, and that essentially solidified the company's future to basically continue to exist and to continue making games. Because again, if like Atlas basically said, like, look, this is your last chance. If this doesn't sell well, we're never working with you again. And no other companies wanted to work with them at this point. So yeah, I think that was actually like a really amazing story of like how the team actually came about, how they kind of overcame adversity and past failures. Because now what's interesting about Vanillaware, and when we're going to talk about this as we talk about some of their games, like they have a lot of creative freedom when it comes to their games. And likewise, their games do not come out that quickly. Like they always take their time with their games. They often get delayed. Like they are kind of like auteurs in their own right. And they've kind of earned that respect from the community from, kind of a bunch of failures, which I think is just really cool to see. So that's some of the history I kind of dug up. And again, we're going to go through the rest of it, kind of talking about each game and, how important there are. So Garrett, what do you think about that story?
That's quite in a redemption arc with Vanillaware here. I did not realize that they were struggling. Yeah, and it still sounds like they're an indie studio, more or less, in Japan. And their games kind of reflect on it. They have a good character behind their games. Cool systems. Each of them has their own kind of identity, but the art style is similar across. It reminds me of like a lot like Supergiant. Yeah. Where they have like, similar art styles kind of like throughout each game, but each game has its own feel to it. Its own system, its own story, its own whatever. So yeah, I really grow fond of Vanillaware and their games.
Yeah, every time I hear about a new game from Vanillaware, I'm always like super excited to learn more.
Yeah.
Like even like when 13 Sentinels got announced, and it was announced as this like weirder mashup that was almost like it was almost like going to be this like mobile game instead, and doing all kinds of weird stuff with it. But then it turned out to be an amazing game. I always just get super excited to hear what's next from them. So let's go some of them. So some of these games, starting with Odin Sphere, of course, released on the PlayStation 2 in 2007. I'm actually a big fan of this game. I actually didn't play it though until the remake came out on PlayStation 4. And then I actually ended up going back and playing the PlayStation 2 version as well, just for kicks, I guess. But did you ever play Odin Sphere? I'm curious, because again, I don't think we've talked too much about Vanillaware games in particular. So I'm not sure which ones you've played and which ones you haven't played.
I have played Odin Sphere on Vita for quite a bit. I think back in like 2017 or whatever.
Yeah, that's when the remake came out.
Yeah. I definitely enjoyed. This is the first vanilla. No, wait. I think it's the first one. Maybe it's Dragon's Crown, but it was probably one of my more favorite fun action RPGs that was on the Vita system at the time. Love the art style with it. I don't know if you heard of a game. I mean, I mentioned it, Maple Story. Yeah. An MMO. It has that same exact like 2D cartoon animation feel, which I absolutely love. It controls really well, and it goes to show you that 2D affect games and whatever. It's like in the action of like the action pace of them can be on par or even better than 3D games. If you guys haven't tried out Odin Sphere, I definitely recommend it. It's on PS4, for sure. Yeah, and I've seen it on sale every now and then.
Yeah, it's one of those games that I'm like, I kind of wish one day they would port it to maybe to Switch, because I felt like the portable version of Odin Sphere is probably the best way to play that game. So it's one of those things where I think that they would, like the Switch, for example, would be like the perfect platform for that game. I think that would be really rad. But Odin Sphere, of course, for folks that aren't familiar with it, it's a side-scrolling hack and slash game. Again, very similar to the description I gave of Princess Crown, because one of the ideas when they were kind of trying to develop their first game on their own as Vanillaware is trying to come up with basically a spiritual successor to Princess Crown. So that's where kind of the idea for Odin Sphere came about, where essentially you have 5 characters, each with their own stories, and then they intersect with each other throughout the experience. But then eventually, when you get towards the end of the game, all 5 characters kind of come together, and you basically choose what characters you want to play as, and they all have like very different like play styles. Like you've got like this Dark Knight character who's got like this really big sword, and he's kind of a slower character. And then you've got another character that flies around. She's like a fairy with like a bow and arrow. So you got like a really interesting mix of characters to choose from in Odin Sphere. And I love how like each of the characters feels just on an even playing field. Like you kind of want to root for all of them in a lot of ways. Like I love how well each one of them is written and how much time they give to each character as well. Because again, each character kind of has its own story, and you learn a lot about each of the individual 5 protagonists. So that in a way, it doesn't feel like there's one clear protagonist. I know a lot of people kind of lead towards Gwendolyn, who's the very first character you play as, who's like a Valkyrie, essentially.
So the mage, right?
Yeah.
Like, I remember her.
Yeah, so she's kind of like the main character, like the first character you start with. So a lot of people think of her as kind of the main character, but in actuality, like all 5 characters, when you really think about it, are kind of the main character of the story. So yeah, I really loved Odin Sphere, the story, the characters, the artwork that you pointed out, especially in the remake in particular. Like the remake, like took that amazing hand-drawn artwork and like took it to another level in particular. That I know though, the PS2 version had a lot of like gameplay issues as far as there were some annoying grinding and stuff like that you had to do in that version of the game. But they changed all that in the remake. So if you played the remake, you don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. So definitely, like, for anyone who's new to the game or anyone who wants to maybe try a Vanillaware game for the first time, like, that's the one I will actually probably always recommend to newcomers.
Me too.
Unless you want a co-op game, in which case we'll get to that one, my recommendation for that a little bit later. But Odin Sphere in particular, really fantastic game and definitely well worth checking out. But then the other game coming out the same year, Grim Grimoire, the strategy game that I told you about, Garrett. You probably haven't played this one, right?
I've never heard of it.
So this is a really interesting one because it kind of like in a way, it kind of combines elements from the Disgaea series with some of the strategy elements into like Vanillaware's visuals, which is just a really interesting thing. But essentially you have like, you're basically kind of defending areas with like multiple levels essentially. So usually there's 3 or 4 levels. And then basically what you do is you assign different units to each level. And then as like enemies move towards you, they fight each other. It kind of reminds me of something like Plants vs. Zombies or something along those lines. But I think game's pretty fun as well. The PSQ controls though are a little bit limiting because the last thing you probably want with a real-time strategy game is probably playing on console. But at the same time, I think it's actually really cool. I think it's going back to Odin Sphere, like even though you don't really have like the mix of protagonists, I think the story in Grim Grimoire is actually really cool. Like I actually really like the writing in that game. The English voices though are not good in that game. So because again, it's a 2007 PS2 JRPG with an English dub. So those were like RPGs in that era from Japan were kind of hit or miss with a lot of English dubs when it comes to voice acting. And unfortunately, Grim Grimoire is not a very good dub. So at the same time, I really love the gameplay. I like the story, and the visuals hold up actually pretty well. Again, it looks like other Vanillaware games as well. So they're always visually stunning. And I definitely recommend checking that one out as well on PlayStation 2. If you're looking for something like really different and you got a PlayStation 2, I think it's actually pretty cool. But next one I want to talk about with you, Garrett, came out on the Wii. And this actually was not, I think it's probably the only game on this list that we're going to talk about besides Grim Grimoire that wasn't published by Atlas, because this was published by Marvelous Entertainment on the Wii. And this is Muramasa, the Demon Blade, 2007, I think is when, or 2008 or 2009. I can't remember the exact year came out. Also got a remake on the Vita as well called Muramasa Rebirth. I didn't play the version on the Wii. I have it, but I've never actually played that version because I played it on Vita, and that game is really awesome. Garrett, did you play Muramasa?
I did not. I haven't heard of this game until like very recently, like a year ago. So, but I heard it looks really good. Like every time I see a Vita list, Muramasa Rebirth is in there along with Odin Sphere. I heard it's really good. Yeah,
Muramasa in particular is actually a lot closer to Odin Sphere than all the other games on this list, where essentially it uses the Odin Sphere formula where you have like large sprawling 2D levels with multiple levels to them, where like you go like you can go all the way up into the trees, or you can stay along the ground. And you basically go from area to area, basically killing enemies. But it's essentially, rather than being like Norse mythology, like Odin Sphere was, it's, Japanese mythology instead. And
cool.
So I really love Muramasa as well. Again, gorgeous game, incredible music. The story is okay though in this one. I don't know if it's as good. Like this is where I think kind of the stories in Vanillaware's games got a little bit worse anyways. Because it wasn't really until in 13 Sentinels, which we'll talk about later, that I really felt the story kind of came around in their games. But Muramasa is so fun to play that it doesn't matter. The story is just okay, because the combat's so fun in Muramasa. You're just, it's almost like, like Wire Kung Fu, where you're basically like, juggling enemies in the air and stuff like that. Like it feels like you're playing like a Kung Fu, like a samurai movie or something like that. But it's got like, wire fighting and stuff like that, like Crouching Tiger.
When I was seeing the gameplay, it reminded me of Dust in Elysian Tale, with all the multiple combos and kicks you could do up in the air and everything like that. It was pretty similar to Dust. I haven't played it. It's kind of hard to get it on Vita, right? You can get it on the store.
You can get it on the store. That's the only way I would recommend people go buy it, unless you want to buy the Wii version, because the Wii version also isn't that expensive, but the physical Vita version is very expensive. So do not go down that route. Yeah. Got to go digital with it, I think. But unfortunately, though, it's like one of those games that takes up, I think it's like 3 or 4 gigs on the Vita, which if you know anything about PlayStation Vitas, like they're, very limited on space as far as, memory cards being expensive. So even on my 64 gig card, I'm like, I don't even know if I leave this installed all the time at this point.
Makes sense. I don't know. We're going to have to think about, when that store gets cut off, what games to keep in certain cards. 'Cause I don't know. I don't know how long they're going to support that thing.
Well, even if they shut down the store, though, they did talk about how you'll be able to download the games again still.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think they're going to do what Nintendo did when they closed the Wii virtual console, where they're like, you can't download anything. Like, I imagine they'll keep the download servers up, but, you know, being able to buy stuff is probably just going to be the thing that they stop doing. So as long as you make sure to buy it before they close the store, you're probably going to be fine. But even if you buy it now, I don't even think it's on a stale price or anything like that. I think it's still like $50. So
I think it's like normal price of, I think it was 40 around the time. So
I'm also thinking Canadian prices too, which so like $10.
Oh, you are Canadian. That's like $2 here in the US. Never mind.
That's a toonie right there. Oh man. But yeah, Muramasa, I highly recommend it. It's awesome. Check it out if you got a Vita or a Wii. I think both versions are probably good. Again, I haven't played the Wii version in particular, but I've heard, you know, nothing but good things about that version too. So next up, Dragon's Crown. This is the other place where I would actually recommend people to start with Vanillaware games if you want to kind of see what Vanillaware is all about and you don't want something that's going to take oodles and oodles of your time. Plus, if you want to play something co-op, because Dragon's Crown is kind of an ode to kind of where George, the company's founder, got his start, because the D&D arcade games from Capcom were basically side-scrolling beat-em-up games, but in the Dungeons and Dragons universe, and they gave you like multiple paths on the map that you could go down, and depending on which path you chose, like the story would play out differently, and you'd fight different enemies and stuff like that. And that's how Dragon's Crown is set up, where it's a 4-player beat-em-up action RPG where characters will kind of level up along the way. It's 4-player online multiplayer as well, which is sweet. And basically you travel between 9 different levels, each with an A and B path associated with them. And depending on which path you go down, you fight a different boss. I love Dragon's Crown. Like, this was kind of like my introduction to Vanillaware, and I loved this game. Garrett, what do you think about Dragon's Crown?
I played it a lot on Vita. I enjoyed it. I think I got to a point in one of the levels where I just kept dying and I did not understand why. I guess I just got kind of confused with the Dragon's Crown and systems, but I've heard other people really, really enjoying this. I love them. The depth of the system and the RPG ness of it, like skill trees, like galore in each of these characters, and weapons as well, and armor. It has a loot grind to it in each level as well, which I really enjoy. But yeah, I think I got to a point where I was like, okay, off to the other game, because I'm just kind of stuck here. But I enjoyed what I played of it. Yeah. And it does have like a loot grind kind of end game that you kind of alluded to, Garrett, where essentially when you get to even the maximum level with a character, there's still stuff to do because you're still grinding for kind of the best loot if you really want to, and beating the game on the hardest difficulty. And also the difficulty, when it increases, it doesn't just, add more hit points to the boss's health total or whatever. It'll introduce new mechanics for the different bosses, and it just adds a layer of complexity to the game that I was not really expecting with a game like this, because for the most part, again, when it's so reminiscent of just an arcade experience, you don't really expect a lot of depth to the gameplay. But there was a ton of depth to Dragon's Crown, while also giving the gameplay itself that arcadey feel that I love to play, back in the day, because I was a big fan of those D&D arcade games growing up. I used to play them in the arcades with my brother Kyle, and they were a lot of fun. So seeing a video game kind of take that idea and really run with it, I thought it was super cool to see. So it's on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 3, and Vita. Like the PS4 version takes advantage of the PS4 Pro. So it actually plays in 4K, which, if you can imagine, Vanillaware graphics in 4K looks pretty dang good. It's beautiful.
Looks pretty good. So especially if you got a nice TV.
Yeah, I played it on Vita. I think I played it a little bit on PS4, and I think I recommend the PS4 version only because of the controls. Yeah. Vita is a little scrunched. The nubs are not too precise or tactile, relating to the action and preciseness you need for an action fighting game. So yeah, I would definitely recommend a PS4 version.
Not only that, but I will also say the PlayStation 4 version is the best place to play it too, because it has the smoothest frame rate. Because the PlayStation Vita version, when it gets really hectic, it runs at like 15 frames per second. Yeah,
it chugs hard.
And the PlayStation 3 version is not so bad, but it's kind of locked at 30 frames per second. But the PlayStation 4 version runs at 60 and it looks like really, really good.
Looks great.
Yeah. And plus it goes on sale all the time as well. Like I think during the last PlayStation sale, when they had like the Japanese game sale, I think it was on sale for like $5. So
I got it for $5.
I was gonna say you get this for pretty
cheap.
dang cheap. So definitely highly recommended for me if you're looking for kind of like an introductory experience to a Vanillaware game. I think there's no better place to start. But then kind of moving away from RPGs, because all of the games we've talked about so far have had a lot of RPG elements to them from Vanillaware. But this one, their newest game, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, doesn't have any RPG elements. So it's not technically an RPG. So we shouldn't even, crossing the taboo line, Garret, of talking about it. But because I am a person on this show, Garret, we're going to talk about this game. You're just going to have to deal with it, okay? So
I heard it's a great game. So
yeah.
All good.
So obviously you haven't played it, right, Garret?
I have played the first hour. I actually got this like pretty early. I don't know. A lot of other games pop up in my Surface, but like this game is on my short list. I actually have the Steelbook like right here in the shelf. So
because this was actually my favorite game of 2020. I fell in love with this game. I didn't really play. I had basically bought it when it came out. I waited on it some more. And basically like with the last 2 weeks of the year, I was like, I got to play 13 Sentinels because the Vanillaware game, I got to play this game so we can talk about it for game of the year. And holy crap, this game knocked my socks off. But I can understand why you haven't gone into it, Garret, because it is a big time commitment because it's basically like a 40-hour game. It's a very long game because it's essentially like a visual novel that's also a real-time strategy game.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds like my two favorite genres just mashed together. Yes. Other than RPGs.
So you're basically like taking control of one of 13 characters. Yes, you play as 13 different characters in this game. And each one of them, kind of like Odin's Sphere, has their own story that progresses throughout the game. And essentially they each have chapters associated with them. And some characters' chapters you can't unlock until you, of course, play other characters' chapters because of the way they kind of intertwine all the stories together. Like it wouldn't make sense if you play certain characters' stories out of order in a lot of ways. But basically you're exploring different classrooms because it takes place in like a near futuristic setting. Essentially, you're exploring like Japanese classrooms or just walking around Tokyo and, going to the store with your friends or talking about, renting kaiju movies from your local, video store and stuff like that. But then your characters suddenly are able to call down mechs. And then there's this whole mystery as to why this is a thing and why there's basically these big monsters that are attacking the city. And you basically figure it out as you kind of explore each person's story and kind of unravel this giant mystery as you go throughout the game. It kind of is like a giant onion where you're like peeling back the layers of the onion as you go. So I really love this game because the story in particular in this like blew me away because of all the twists and turns it takes to just how well written it is and how interesting it is that they tie the characters' stories together. And there's nothing that really like overlaps too much in the sense that you're not really seeing the same, because sometimes when you see like multiple character stories like this, you'll see like dialogue carry over 2 or 3 times when you revisit certain key moments with different characters. But in this game, that doesn't really happen at all. So I love kind of that aspect to it where it all just feels really fresh and new. But I wouldn't recommend that this being a place where people start with Vanillaware games because of the time commitment that's put into it. Come on with the fact that the genres that I listed off, Garret, appeal to you, but as you can imagine, probably don't appeal to everyone, right? So
it's not, it's not really an RPG. It has elements of RPGs.
Well, there's not really a leveling or anything like that. Like you're not really getting experience or anything like that. So it's not really an RPG, which is why like, otherwise, we probably would end up doing an entire episode devoted to this game. But I actually think this game's incredible. It's still like a must play, though, for anyone. If anything I just told you sounds remotely appealing, like you should play this game. And the best part is,
I have a question.
Sure, what's up?
So there's 13 characters in here. That is 5 more than Octopath Traveler.
That's true.
Like, is it like at all confusing or convoluted, or just having 13 characters seems a little much?
You would think so, but they made it. I think they managed to pull it off really, really well with the 13 characters. And because the way they kind of do it is that each of the characters kind of has like a relationship that they have with like one or two of the other characters essentially. And they kind of like, in a way, it's almost like 7 or 8 individual stories that are then tied into this one like bigger narrative in a lot of ways. And you kind of learn more about it kind of as you go. So I think all the characters are really interesting in their own ways. Like there are even some characters where I thought at the beginning when I started playing as like a particular character, like there's one character that's kind of like a bully, he just goes around and beating people up. And I'm like, am I really going to like this guy? But no, by the end of the game, I was like, this guy's cool. I like this guy. So it's like, I think that there's, so it really subverted a lot of my expectations anyways. Cool. And really just, it is so well written and fantastic. So yeah, I don't think that there's really that problem where again, you probably would think, hey, there's probably, one or two of these stories I'm not going to care about, but I don't know. The way they kind of feed into the main narrative just makes you care about characters you probably wouldn't have thought you'd ever care about in this type of game.
Sounds good. And these are all kids in a school, right? Like that's the typical like start of this game.
Yeah, they're all kids at a school, but how they got there is different. And again, that's kind of going to be as far as I kind of lean into that. And people have played before, that's what I'm going to probably referring to. But then there is also the game is also coming to Switch, so there's that as well. So it is coming out on Switch in April. So besides PlayStation 4, it's on another console. And actually, that might be the place to play this one too, because there is so much reading. Like I think visual novels just work really well as portable games. So I definitely think that's probably the best approach. And to be fair, it's not really like a traditional visual novel because you're not like reading text along the bottom of the screen while your characters don't move. It's a lot of walking around and talking to people, but it still plays out a lot like a visual novel would in that way. So that's just why I refer to it as that, even though the gameplay, if you just looked at it at first glance, probably wouldn't seem that way. But there you go. Cool. Those are all Vanillaware's games that they've released so far. There's not too many of them, but I think as you can probably hear from the way we talk about these games, all of them are really fantastic. So I think that they're a company with like a really interesting history associated with them, combined with the fact that I think they just make fantastic games. But Garrett, the question I wanted to ask you as we kind of round out this conversation is, we don't know what's happening next at Vanillaware because we know that obviously 13 Sentinels is coming to Switch soon, but that's all we know about them right now. So what do you think is going to happen with Vanillaware in the future? And what type of game would you like to see from them in the future?
That's a good question. When did Dragon's Crown come out? Like 2011 or something like that? 2012?
No, it was day and date with the Vita, so it had to be at least 2012.
Okay, I think it could have been 12 or 13, something like that. So that's about like a 7 to 8 year gap. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't plan to see another Vanillaware game for a pretty long time, maybe 2025. Now, I
should preface though, between the time that we got Dragon's Crown and 13 Sentinels, we got the remake of Odin Spear from them. We got Dragon's Crown coming to PlayStation 4, and we had Muramasa come to Vita. So we did have 3 games in there. They were just remakes and other projects. Yeah.
Cool. I don't imagine them even doing any other revitalizing other than porting these games to Switch.
Grim Grimoire coming to Switch. Let's go.
Yeah, that would be great. A new game coming from Vanillaware. I'm not too sure. I really like their identity as an action-based game. I hope their next game really comes out on the handheld system that's going to be there at the time, whether it's the Switch 2 or anything like that. I hope they keep their hand-drawn art style, but I don't have any like really focused game that I really want them to do. Maybe, try a different type of genre. They've done a pretty good job of 13 Sentinels, and you said they execute it really well, doing a real-time strategy along with visual novels. Like, okay, why don't you try something like really different again? I think I feel like they do a lot of experimenting, even though they draw back from their previous experiences. They have a brand new thing that comes to the table, which is really cool. I like their identity a lot, and I hope other people actually give these games a try, because I know they're small, but they're very accessible. At least Dragon's Crown and Odin Sphere and 13 Sentinels. Those 3 games are probably, I think people should really, it's one of those required, like if you're an RPG fan, definitely Odin Sphere and Dragon's Crown. Those are heavy hitters. So yeah, that's what I think about them. They're a really good team, and I'm always looking forward to what they're gonna do next.
Yeah, and I think your comparison to them, as we've gone through this conversation, to Supergiant is just on point. We're just like Supergiant, like whenever they announce whatever their next game is going to be after Hades, like all eyeballs are going to be on them, because we want to know what's going to be coming next from them. And same with Vanillaware. Like I'm just excited to see where they're going to go from there and what kind of like crazy ideas they could do with their next game. Although when you kind of look back at their history and as we've kind of talked about each one of their games, for the most part, they've really had like 2 different gameplay styles. They've only done real-time strategy games and action RPGs. Like those are basically like their two kind of gameplay styles, their bread and butter, as you will. So I imagine their next game's probably going to stick with one of those 2, but I would love to see, as you talked about, like I would love to see maybe them do like a different genre, almost like Supergiant did with something like, not
Pyre.
Hades, Pyre. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's like maybe do like a Vanillaware sports game or something like that. Like something like really, really, really weird. Like
Give me
I would love
card-based RPG, or I don't know, like maybe something turn-based for once coming from them. That would be kind of cool.
Yeah, that would be pretty interesting.
You know?
Yeah, so
especially with a hand-drawn style. Yeah,
for sure. Like especially because we already see stuff like Astria Ascending or some other modern games trying to do the hand-drawn style, but for RPGs. Like seeing Vanillaware maybe enter that space with like a turn-based RPG, I think would be pretty cool. The one thing I will say though is whatever comes next, I also want them to put as much a focus on the story as they did with 13 Sentinels and not go backwards when it comes to the story. Like for example, if they ever did a Dragon's Crown 2, I would love to see them put as much focus on the story as they did with 13 Sentinels with that game. It doesn't have to be 13 protagonists, but it's got. I would love to see a well-written story, but with that combat, I think would be incredible. Because one of the things about Dragon's Crown that I think is its major weakness is the writing. Because it's kind of like a generic story. It's over before you know it, and you forget it like the minute you put the game down. Whereas 13 Sentinels is a story experience that I will probably not forget for the rest of my life. So I would love to see them put that much care into the story of whatever game comes next, more than anything, and kind of go back to the older days of Vanillaware with Odin Sphere, with Grim Grimoire, where the stories were actually a lot stronger. So that's kind of my hope for them. But yeah, just like you, I would love to see them their take on like all kinds of different genres, like a sports game, like a card battling game or something like that. Like I think that would be like super cool. So I think they do all kinds of interesting stuff. But then I also have to float out the idea, Garrett, because they are an independent studio right now. We know acquisition season is a thing right now at the time
it is
that they're recording this. Do you ever think that Vanillaware actually gets purchased by a company at some point? Or do you think they ever merge with another company? I mean, they work with Atlas a lot. So in a lot of ways, they're kind of like an Atlas studio, but they're not actually owned by Atlas. They're not contractually bound to them anyway or anything like that. But what do you think?
I feel like they're just a little too small to even be in the eyes of like, let's say Sony or Xbox. I don't think they're looking at studios like these. Now, maybe something like a Sega or something like a NIS, like I could see them, if it makes sense to bring them into the family, into the fold. But I just don't see much Japanese, like the small indie Japanese studios, you don't see those being gobbled up. You don't see those being acquired left and right, as we were seeing a lot with Xbox and Sony right now in somewhere other than Japan, right? We do a lot more bigger companies, a lot bigger acquisitions these days. So yeah, I don't see Vanillaware being like snapped up anytime soon. And even if they do, I really think it's just going to be with other like-minded studios such as NIS or Atlas or something like that.
I think it comes down to it being a cultural thing too, where like Japanese studios aren't going out there and buying just a ton of Japanese studios. It's just not really a thing that happens there all that often, unless you're Nintendo and it's like next level, or even not next level games because they're not based in Japan, but like Monolith Soft, for example, where it's like they've worked with Nintendo for a while and they decide to purchase them kind of thing. But like that type of thing is rare for a lot of Japanese companies, which you brought up. So yeah, I don't think they're necessarily going to be acquired for a while, but I would be very surprised if they work with someone besides Atlas for at least the foreseeable future anyways. Like I would be very surprised if their next game came out and it was published by like, Take-Two or something like that. Kind of like, how From Software's Sekiro was published by Activision or something like that. Like I don't ever think that thing is going to happen, but especially because their games are smaller.
Yeah, I hope Vanillaware comes to Xbox. Those games, like, coming to Xbox, coming to Game Pass. I think Game Pass is a great way of showing a lot of Japanese games that normally Xbox consumers would not buy. Yeah. This is a very unique gem from Japan that needs to be in the Xbox scene.
And we've been seeing more and more of it. Like we had the Somnium Files, a game that I thought would never come to Xbox because it's too weird.
I couldn't believe it.
As well as like a bunch of Bandai Namco games like Scarlet Nexus and stuff like that too. So yeah, I could definitely see it coming to Xbox eventually. It just depends on what Sega wants to do because I especially because if they work with Atlas, they're obviously working with Sega. Right?
Atlas is super weird with their stuff. I can't trust their logic.
That's true. You mean to tell me you sell Persona 4 on PC and it sells well and you do the surprise Pikachu face because it sold well? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That was the thing.
They were so surprised.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're right. Atlas decisions don't really make any sense. I mean, we're still waiting for that Persona, February announcement, Garrett, and it's probably going to be another watch or something like that just in time for
It's going to be another vinyl just to spite us. I can't with them.
It's the vinyls again.
Reimagined. I was like, oh no.
Good Lord. So there you go. That was our conversation about Vanillaware. Overall, I think we did them justice. I know it's a bit of a shorter show than usual, but part of that is also we just didn't have a lot of questions either. So before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter @BlandExplosion, and you can also find me in the Nintendo Shack, a Nintendo podcast, part of the Play Some Video Game Podcast Network, where we're live normally on Thursday nights at twitch.tv/PSVG, and also available at other podcast services. And there you go.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter @Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter @Yumi Capri's, on YouTube at youtube.com/Yumi Capri, and on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the 34th level of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is powered by patrons over at patreon.com/Yumi Capri. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you to our over 70 patrons, starting with our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Jonathan Brown, the man behind the music on the Xbox Drive and the Nintendo Drive. You can check out his new album, In My Element, over on Apple Music, as well as his website, and Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team. Our platinum producers are Robbie Bobby Miller and Trucker Sloth, and our gold members, Argo, Brandon Myers, Dallas Robbins, Dano, Emily O'Kelly, Foolish Fuji, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Marcus O'Neill, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, RJ Kern, Skinny Matt, Tony Baker, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support. And if you're interested in joining the Patreon, head over to patreon.com/Yumi Capri and pick the tier that's right for you.